Hi, my name's Mark Cooper and I'm going to be doing this segment with Frank Peel and Sian Evans. I've been working in the oil industry for 35 years as a structural geologist, technical manager and consultant. Before I moved to industry, I was an academic teaching at University College Cork in Ireland. And since retiring from Encana in 2007, I've been working as a consultant doing project work for clients and teaching technical training and field courses. I also took up my honorary position at Aberdeen, where I mostly teach on the IPG MSc course. In the early part of my career, going to TSG was an important part of professional development, and I did that pretty much every year until I got posted overseas in the late 1980s by BP. My first TSG meeting was Exeter in 1974. Which was dominated by Greenland high-grade rocks with unpronounceable names and crystal deformation processes. No fractures, it was not fashionable. My only memory of that particular TSG is the Start Point field trip with Alison Rees, Andy Siddons and a large dog. So on to 1975, memorable for a comment on a talk by Stan White, which went along the lines of, "You cannot treat rocks as some peculiar kind of metal." So now we get to the first topic, thin-skin fold and thrust belts. And that was really discussed in detail at the 1979 Thrust and Nap Tectonics meeting at Imperial. I was working with Jake Hossack, who knew Dave Elliott at Johns Hopkins. Dave took us on an Appalachians field trip where we learned a lot about the classic geometry of a thin-skin fold and thrust belt. We were already working on the Basse Normandy duplex in the Boulonnais, applying some of Dave Elliott's methods based on Bert Bally and Clint Dahlstrom's exploration of the foothills in Alberta with Shell and Chevron. Classical bed length of the duplex didn't remove a thickness change at the duplex tip due to layer parallel shortening not related to the brittle faulting. Other researchers had made similar observations elsewhere, and we should all have paid more attention to this. Basically, what it was telling us was that by just removing the faulting, you were not necessarily removing all of the deformation effects. Okay, so after this, 30 years of section balancing frenzy started. Everybody was balancing sections. But we were using a limited set of assumptions about folding in thrust belts. And we also were using a limited set of algorithm solutions for kinematic modelling that were rooted in geometry rather than an understanding of how folds form. Buckle folds are still severely underrepresented, and this needs to change. So why did industry focus so much time and effort on section construction and restoration, in other words, balancing? Well, it impacts the drilling target. See the models change in the Bolivia example. It impacts the critical risk in exploring FTBs, the timing relationship between structure development and the migration of hydrocarbons. Also, the choice of kinematic model impacts fracture prediction, which is critical to flow rates from low permeability reservoirs. So this was important, but we perhaps focused too much on it. So, on to inversion, which comes on the scene. Bert Bally's paper in 1982 has an elegant cartoon of inversion. Bert had a rare talent for making the complex simple. The Inversion Tectonics meeting in 1987 formalized the recognition of inversion. Regional elevation is a key concept in this. When we see beds structurally elevated above regional, there are two basic choices we always have: significant thin-skin thrust repetition or inversion of pre-existing fault structures. Inversion is now regarded as an integral component of orogenic deformation and a common effect of any localized compressional stress in basins distant from origins. So things moved on, and by 1989, extensional fault control basins and the patterns of sediment filling the accommodation space that was created by the faulting were better understood from outcrops, sandbox models and better seismic data. 3D concepts of fault linkage and displacement transfer were developed, and critically the relationship between faults, sediment pathways into basins, and the impact on facies distribution. This revolutionized exploration in rift basins and on passive margins. A lot of this was occurring simultaneously as the ideas of inversion were coming into more common usage, but the piece about the extensional faulting and the sediment control that it exerted was not fully recognized initially. So to understand inversion, it really is essential to understand the pre-existing extensional fault geometry and the geometry of the sediment that infilled the accommodation space. It's now appreciated that most orogenic belts contain a combination of inversion structures created by reactivation of older basin controlling faults and classic thin-skinned fold thrust belt structures. We need to understand this to unravel the true complexities of deformation associated with compression. It's not all thin-skinned, it's not all thick-skinned. So as my final sort of topic, I'm going to touch on fractures. In the last 20 years, fractures have become increasingly important in industry as low permeability reservoirs and unconventional oil and gas resources have been developed. Fractures provide permeability and in some cases the storage for the hydrocarbons. Better models of the relationship of fractures to larger scale structures, more sophisticated well logging, and the development of reservoir scale fracture models that can be used in fluid flow simulations have all contributed to our understanding. Even in porous reservoirs and aquifers, fractures often fundamentally influence fluid flow. And with that, I'll hand over to Frank.
Here is my personal history, my experience of salt tectonics as seen in industry. I entered the oil industry in 1985. I hadn't been paying attention at university, so I knew nothing about salt tectonics. So I was looking forward to learning all about salt. In 1985, the prevailing wisdom was dispensed to us. We had a diapir-centered view of the universe. Salt tectonics equals diapirs. Diapirs were interesting things found in the North Sea where salt floats up through the sediment because it's buoyant. Salt starts at the bottom of the section and rises up through sediments that are denser than the salt, that's what we were told, until it reaches sediments of the same density. At that neutral buoyancy position, it stopped. Deformation we saw around these diapirs, to be sure, and that was also interpreted as being all about the diapirs. The peripheral sinks and the secondary peripheral sinks or rim sink lines were seen to be like donut-shaped features around the diapirs. But by the late 1980s, we were starting to see a slightly bigger picture as we looked deeper in the section. We could see, if you take that previous section and mirror it about the end, what you see instead is a withdrawal basin. Now this is no surprise because Truesheim back in the 1960s had already said this, but as I said, I had not been paying attention at university. Did not know this until we discovered this for ourselves. It's all about mini basins. It's not about diapirs. So the consequence of this is it's not about buoyancy at all. It's actually about the mini basins. And they sink as long as their average density is greater than the salt. It doesn't matter where in that mini basin you achieve neutral buoyancy. It really doesn't matter. The mini basins sink, they displace salt out from underneath them, and the salt moves into the area in between to form the diapirs. by moving away from the diapirs, we can see that the area we had been looking at, where the reservoirs tended to be thin or even absent, and it was faulted and compartmentalized, that gave rise to lots of small traps. But if you moved away, the reservoirs got thicker, the structures got simpler, but unfortunately also tended to be more synclinal. So in 1990, I moved to the Gulf of Mexico. Yee-haw! And where they told me about the big discovery that had been made a few years previously called Mars. This was the answer to all their problems because it told them all they needed to do to explore for oil. It had bright seismic amplitudes. It sat in a syncline. So we were told we now have a syncline play. We don't need to look for traps. All we need to do is look for amplitudes in synclines. That's all there is to it. And we don't need no stinking geologists to do that either. Well, surprise, surprise, this did not end well. After a year or so of strings of dry holes in many companies, we took stock and decided you needed to be a bit more intelligent than that. So going back a bit, in the Gulf of Mexico, by the early 80s, there'd been a lot of wells drilled in the shelf, and they'd found a lot of sand. But as drilling went further out to what they called the flecks, the sand thinned and tended to disappear. So the preconception was that there was simply going to be no sand any further down the slope beyond the flecks. By the late 1980s, this had been proved to be wrong. A couple of wells out there in the deep water, Outwater 471, Blackjack in particular, showed there was a pile of sand out there in the Mars field, sand with oil in. So we were what was this data like that we were looking at? Here is late 1980s state-of-the-art seismic data. Isn't it beautiful? You can see the seafloor, you can see some supersalt sediments, and maybe you can see the top of the salt, but you try interpreting subsalt on that. Well, that was my job. And we were starting to see hints of features beneath the salt sheets. But I remember going to a meeting where the chief geophysicist told us, there is no oil trapped beneath salt. That's physically impossible. And the reason for that conception was that when you bury sediment, the water squeezes out. And if you've got a salt sheet over the top, that water has to go sideways a long way, leading to extremely high fluid pressure, no seal capacity, no oil fields. But what they didn't factor in was there were some pretty good aquifers that drained the pressure out. So you get good seal capacity and lots of fields. So over the next few years, we drilled successfully further and further back into the salt. Atlantis, Mad Dog, Shenzi, Tahiti, huge discoveries. And we're starting to get some better seismic data. And at this point I heard somebody say there is no oil ever being found on oceanic crust. By the end of this story, we discovered actually a lot of this oil that we discovered was on oceanic crust because even the deep salt was allochthonous. Final thing I heard before leaving was you can't have an oil field in a base salt closure, which is just not true. But it's amazing how these preconceptions keep on coming round. So I went off to academia, now working on research and other things like carbon capture. Interesting thing about carbon capture is we've now gone full circle back to those diapirs we started with. And the reason why we got out of the diapirs, because of their complexity and compartmentalization and thin reservoirs, is exactly the good reason for getting into it for CO2. You inject the CO2 down dip, the CO2 makes its way up into the diapir flanks, and it gets nicely trapped up there. And we're never going to want to produce it. So we don't care how compartmentalized it is. We don't care how crappy the reservoir is. So at the end of this journey of exploration, one thing I have discovered is that almost all my preconceptions turned out to be wrong. And a lot of the received wisdom that I picked up secondhand turned out to be, if anything, slightly dodgy, if not outright wrong. So maybe it's time for some new rules. And the only rule I suggest for anybody is there are no stinking rules, other than look at the data yourself, think about it for yourself, and develop your own ideas, because they are going to be better than any of mine, which are soon going to be out of date. And with that, I'm going to stop talking about the past and pass you over to somebody who's going to talk about the present day and the future. So over to you.
So thank you to Frank and Mark for reflecting on their experiences over the past few decades. We're now going to change tack slightly, and I'm going to give the perspective of someone relatively new to the game and have a look at what's currently happening in the world of salt tectonics in particular. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sian. I very recently finished my PhD in salt tectonics at Imperial College in London, and I will be starting a postdoc at Oslo Uni as soon as they let me out of quarantine. So I was first exposed to the world of salt tectonics during my master's in petroleum geoscience, and my first impression of the field was something along the lines of, my God, this is a minefield of terminology. Ordinary words like turtles, pillows, teardrops, flaps suddenly had a whole new meaning, but really the plethora of terminology speaks to the wonderful variety of structures that salt tectonics entails. So my interest was sufficiently piqued to stick around. And once you get to grips with the terminology, you have to wade carefully through the long history of literature. These old papers have wonderful ideas and were really pioneering in their day, but not all of those ideas have stood the test of time. As Frank introduced nicely, one of those is the concept of buoyancy, which was once thought to be the be-all and end-all of salt rise. And naive students can trip up after taking a shallow dive in the classic literature, which is exactly what happened to me on a field trip during my master's, when standing in the middle of a salt diapier, I confidently claimed in front of my class that buoyancy was the key driving force behind these structures. That earned me a strong scowl from the trip leader, and I learned never to trust an old paper again. And so as the literature records the evolution of these ideas through the decades, it also preserves some really great debates. So for example, you can find a whole host of papers toing and froing on the relative importance of gravity gliding and gravity spreading in driving salt tectonic deformation. Of course, now we accept that these mechanisms represent end members of a spectrum, and as is the case in many such debates in science, the only real answer to the question is, it depends. So after 100 odd years of debates in the world of salt tectonics, you'd think we have it all figured out. Absolutely not. If there's one thing we can be sure of in salt and in structural geology generally, it's that there is still lots that we don't know. So usually I'm very anti-slide clutter, but for this I broke my own rule because I want to emphasize the sheer quantity and diversity of active research in the salt tectonic community. With all the technological developments driven by the industrial thirst for knowledge, we have more and more data of better and better quality, which means that we can explore the subsurface in ways that our counterparts in the early days could only dream of. So I just wanted to highlight some of those exciting areas of active research, and this is by no means an exhaustive list whatsoever, but I've compiled some figures with the help of the salty Twitter sphere. So I'm biased, but I think we have a pretty great community of researchers all over the world, and especially the ECRs, who are really driving forward our understanding of some of the most complex topics in salt tectonics. Dealing with things such as multi-phase deformation or multiple detachment levels, the role of heterogeneous salt and rheological stratification, subsurface fluid flow, orogenic belts, and the role of salt in all of these different settings. and re-evaluating basins that we once thought that we understood and now have a different perspective on, and realise that there is still a lot that we don't know about how salt behaves and how these structures evolved. So I could go on, and I don't have time to do any of these subjects justice, but I hope you get the idea. So as we've discussed, and as Frank and Mark have discussed, a lot of this research has been made possible thanks to its applications in the oil and gas industry. And it's great that our research is still helping to improve efficiency in the exploration and extraction of those resources. But we also know that times are changing. The energy industry is changing. So how can we apply this understanding more broadly to tackle these new challenges? Well, thankfully, many of the energy solutions that will help to tackle climate change also require a robust understanding of the subsurface. Since I've been focusing on salt here, I've put together a few examples of how salt tectonics is being applied in some of these emerging industries. So one example is Germany, where they've been using salt mines to store nuclear waste for decades with varying levels of success. But new 3D geological models are helping to manage the storage of nuclear waste as safely as possible in these abandoned mines. There is also some super interesting work ongoing into the feasibility of man-made solution-mined salt caverns in offshore salt structures as a storage for hydrogen fuel. So storing hydrogen safely is one of the major problems with using hydrogen as a fuel, and there could be a solution to that in the storage of hydrogen in these offshore salt structures. We could also see salt playing a role in the geothermal energy industry. Due to its high thermal conductivity, salt perturbs geotherms, and there's some work that's been done in the Netherlands to suggest that this could be used to enhance geothermal energy systems. And finally, of course, I have to give a shout out to carbon capture and storage. We know that salt has excellent sealing properties and forms many traps. So there is a lot of work currently ongoing in how we can effectively use these structures to safely sequester carbon dioxide in the subsurface. So these are just some examples, but it's clear that the successful implementation of these solutions requires an understanding of fluid flow in the subsurface, of pressure distributions, mechanical properties, all of the understanding of structural developments that Frank discussed, as well as the fracture networks that Mark discussed. And essentially all of the knowledge that we've gained from the oil and gas industry can be leveraged in these new technologies. So I'll just finish by saying that, in my opinion at least, structural geology and industry has a lot to look forward to. And I'll end it there. Thank you.